local sustainability and stewardship. And last year, CAM published a report for the Alberta Land Institute on the legal authority of municipalities to promote biodiversity. And finally, we are very fortunate that Catherine Shier, Principal Ecological Planner, City Planning, City of Edmonton, can join us today. Catherine is a professional biologist who works to ensure that the needs of nature and its flora and fauna are considered in the urban planning process. Catherine has a Master of Sciences in Environmental Biology and Ecology from the University of Alberta, and she leads the city's ecological mapping and wildlife passage and monitoring work. So we have a busy program. Let's get started. We'll be pleased to take your questions after the presentations, but feel free to type them into the Q&A window at any time. So Cam, over to you.
All right, thank you, Aran. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to share some of the work that we've done over the last couple of years in the area of municipalities and biodiversity. So as Aran mentioned, let's see if we can get the slides going. Here we go. So as Aran mentioned, last year we published a report called Subsidiarity in Action, Effective Biodiversity Conservation and Municipal Innovation. And I'm grateful to the ALI for posting this on their website and sharing it. And so here's the link that you can follow after the presentation if you're interested in reading a little bit more. It was a project funded by the Alberta Real Estate Foundation that was really spurred on by some of the changes that had occurred to the Municipal Governments Act since its renovation and modernization was started in 2015. As Professor Koplinski mentioned, the majority of my work is international environmental law and transboundary cooperative action to try and achieve conservation. But, you know, I have always had some interest in my own place and where we live and the nature that we experience and kind of the decisions that are happening in our backyard, if you will. So that's really what spurred this research project and really has got me interested more and more in these topics. So my kind of first 15 to 17 minutes here, I'm going to try and whet the appetite for everyone that's in attendance and get us on the same page for kind of the discussions that are going to follow for the rest of the presentations. So to make sure we're all thinking about these ideas and these concepts in the same kind of terminology, it makes sense to start with kind of our understanding of biodiversity and obviously the diversity and variety of life that's found on Earth, the assemblages that they form and the interactions between living and non-living aspects of the environment. Now, there's different scales and levels at which we can measure biodiversity, from our backyard to our urban park or to different ecosystems and beyond. And it's commonly, right, in the news these days, more and more evidence suggesting that biodiversity is in a fairly rapid decline. And Canada is no exception to this trend. I mean, we have the WWF Living Planet report for Canada that just came out quite recently that speaks to quite startling losses across different types of populations and species. And so, you know, the municipal aspect fits into this discussion because these losses occur across jurisdictional and political boundaries. And further, as we talk about municipal innovation or approaches to conservation, it makes sense that we're increasingly looking at municipalities and urban, peri-urban, and rural environments because 81% of Albertans currently live and experience nature on a day-to-day basis in kind of an urban or peri-urban setting. And so that's the vast majority of our population. And so these are issues that we have to confront and figure out the best way to manage and conserve. So the importance of local biodiversity, I mean, this is something that maybe for a number of people that are in attendance just rings true for a variety of reasons. But I think it's always important to remind ourselves of kind of what makes the areas that we live attractive, and what makes biodiversity important to our community for a variety of reasons. So it's no coincidence, obviously, that human settlement and urbanization is occurring in biodiverse, rich areas where there's quite a suitable habitat or environment for all manner of species to flourish. And that's true across landscapes, right? And when we're talking about biodiversity, one of the features that always rings out to me is that we live in a large province. We live in a large province with a lot of different perspectives and upbringings and local cultures for these sorts of approaches to wildlife or to the environment. And so when we're thinking about biodiversity conservation, it's clear that there's going to be no one size fits all approach. There's going to be a different approach that will be palatable for the large urban centers. There will be different approaches for the peri-urban centers. And then for rural environments, there's going to be different approaches as well, where maybe wildlife interactions are viewed differently, and conservation initiatives are viewed differently than they are in an urban or peri-urban experience. So lots of diversity and biocultural diversity across the province that makes this, I think, a really rich area of study for what makes sense locally in our own backyards. And then in terms of the importance of local biodiversity more generally, there's quite a bit of evidence and good evidence that biodiversity creates more livable environments and enjoyable environments. For humans, it helps improve the quality of life, both physical and mental. It connects people to a non-human built world and to a different experience. It provides a variety of environmental services, be it air, water, and soil quality, pollination services, flood buffering, climate mitigation and adaptation. It helps us maintain connectivity to surrounding landscapes as animals are moving through at various times of the year, and then also improves the overall resilience of ecosystems, which is obviously important given our time of uncertainty around the climate crisis and changing kind of conditions to our ecological systems. So those are some of the kind of utilitarian perspectives to biodiversity conservation. And then also, I think there's quite a strong push now to recognize the worth of protecting animals and their assemblages for their intrinsic value and their own importance. And so that becomes another aspect of a justification for local and municipal biodiversity conservation. So from the legal perspective, which is really how I approach some of these questions and these problems, there's a whole suite of issues that emerges when you start diving into municipal biodiversity conservation. And a couple of the big questions that we had in mind when we were examining the report and thinking about these issues at different levels was, what is the authority to act? What authority do municipalities have? Is it an obligation? Is it something that is voluntary? And then what is the scope of what this authority allows? And is there room for innovation or creation of new or novel approaches that can help complement a lot of the excellent work that's currently being done across the province? And, I guess that these questions really share one of the core issues of Canadian environmental law, which invariably engages issues around jurisdiction, right? So the environment isn't an area of one level of authority in the Canadian constitutional or federalist structure. It's an area of shared authority where there is a constant pull, right? A constant tug of war that's going on. And we've seen this play out in a variety of contexts, including, right, the current carbon pricing debate that is going to the Supreme Court for argument in the next couple of weeks. And so there is going to be this inherent tension when we're thinking about who at what level should act to tackle or address some of these issues. And then the added wrinkle obviously, to this from the legal perspective is that municipalities are not constitutionally recognized as a level of government under our framework. Rather, they derive their authority from provincial legislation that creates, enables, and authorizes their action. And so that is what leaves municipalities open to some vulnerabilities, but also to some moments of new empowering perspectives on what we can do to act for some of these issues. So I think there's a strong justification for municipal action to address some of the biodiversity concerns that we're currently seeing. At the core, I think municipalities are really well positioned to assess their local ecosystems and the needs of their human residents, and then also to develop an appropriately tailored conservation response that can develop and grow with the communities as they are changing and developing. From the legal, again, from the legal perspective, one of the principles that has worked its way into Canadian jurisprudence somewhat infrequently is this notion of subsidiarity. And it was kind of the hook that has driven me through this work. And that's the notion that management and regulation is often best left to the smallest possible political entity capable of addressing an issue at hand. And we saw the Supreme Court give some, albeit fairly rudimentary analysis of this principle and its application to municipal governance issues in the Hudson Spray Tech decision back in 2001, which dealt with a cosmetic pesticide ban in a Quebec city, and whether or not that action could fit within the other pesticide regulation approaches that were taken at the provincial and federal level. And it was found that yes, this municipal initiative was appropriate, it was justified. Subsidiarity was one of the notions that helped justify this as local kind of malleable action in response to some of these citizen concerns. And as you follow that principle through the jurisprudence, which I said is kind of infrequent in the Canadian context, I think what ends up coming out is that we get a clear sense that all levels of government have an ability to act to conserve and steward the environment and biodiversity. And I think the way that it fits locally, or at least there's a strong argument for it, is that the best approach is to think about consistency and a bit of a complementary action. And so it is something that can build upon and improve what's happening at the other levels of government to have that local effect. And then considering them in concert, and ideally you'd have some coherence here between these approaches, you can really start to see a tapestry that is woven together that leads to better outcomes for the environment and for biodiversity. And so that's kind of the approach that I think we can see hopefully developing as we move forward for a coherent and holistic approach to biodiversity conservation. So the MGA is the enabling legislation for municipalities in Alberta. I'm sure we're mostly aware of that. Now, you'll hear a little bit more about this in the other presentations in a bit more detail, but environmental protection hasn't traditionally been a focus of this enabling legislation. So the MGA was first consolidated from other pieces of legislation in 1967 and then again in 1994. And as I mentioned at the outset, what interested me and I think people right now in this topic is that it was modernized through a series of amendments starting in 2015. And one of the purposes of these modernizations or renovations was to provide municipalities with tools to help build and support sustainable communities. And biodiversity, I think, is an important pillar of the notion of a sustainable community. So just to give us a little bit of certainty on what some of these amendments did, I've picked three that we can briefly look at to think about sort of the way in which these modernizations or renovations have changed what's possible or what's expected of action at the municipal level. And so one is an expanded municipal purpose. The second is the city charter regulations and the third is conservation reserves. And so I'll speak briefly to each of these in turn. So in order for municipal action to be justified, it has to be based in a municipal purpose. Some of the municipal purposes that are up on this slide are the traditional municipal purposes, so safe and viable communities, good government, services and facilities for citizens, etc. And the addition that was made was A.1, and that is to foster the well-being of the environment. So it is a municipal purpose to foster the well-being of the environment. And a couple things jump out here, I think. And one is that this is a freestanding purpose that is for the environment. It doesn't say necessarily to foster the well-being of the environment for its human residents. Rather, it is for the environment itself. And so it becomes sort of this freestanding obligation to improve or to steward or to maintain environmental quality as a valid municipal purpose as you're looking at bylaws or other means of action available to a municipality. Now, it also has ambiguity. Environment is not defined, right? Foster, I mean, that is an action, right? There's an action to that word, but it also goes relatively undefined, and well-being is also something that has some ambiguity to it. But arguably, it opens the door to creating an obligation for municipalities across the province to take under their initiative the sort of actions that can help improve environmental quality for both citizens and, importantly, for the environment itself, which biodiversity would be a key aspect. The second applies to currently to Alberta's two largest cities, so Edmonton and Calgary, and that was part 4.1 of the MGA, which creates or facilitates the promulgation of city charters. All right, and so this allows cities to best address or meet the evolving needs and responsibilities of their communities. And these amendments go further than the purpose that is applicable to all municipalities in the province. And here we see some additions that provide specific authority for these two large cities. And the following is an excerpt from the Edmonton City Charter Regulation, but the language is analogous in the City Charter Regulation of Calgary. And so here we see that the well-being of the environment, right, is something that can be fostered and developed through bylaws and programs that deal with a variety of enumerated issues. And one of those that is expressed is the protection of biodiversity and habitat. Now, this also has some ambiguity associated with it. I mean, bylaws, I think, are pretty clear to people, but what is meant by programs? What are the programs of action that you could envision a municipality creating to steward or improve biodiversity and habitat? And so I think there is a lot of room for innovation and creativity in here. Obviously, there's funding challenges and those sorts of realities of municipal governance, especially right now. But I think that there's quite a bit that could be justified under this language, and we've explored some of those in the report that I've highlighted at the beginning. And then the third is the addition of conservation reserves. And so here you have a new ability to set aside land for environmentally significant features during the process of subdivision. So for new growth potential in a city. And this could be dedicating land as a wildlife corridor, identifying significant tree stands, and then having to protect it essentially through paying a fair market value for it. And so again, financial constraints will limit this, but I think that there is something new here that obviously could complement other approaches that were previously available to municipalities for conserving and prioritizing biodiversity. So just to bring this kind of full circle before I pass the virtual floor over to my friends and colleagues, I'd just like to say that these are some of the new approaches, but one of the things that really rang out to us, I think, doing this research was that there's a lot of initiatives that are already being undertaken. And in order to really prioritize biodiversity, I think municipalities need to start to weave it through all of the different options that are available. And I've listed some of the other traditional options on this slide that the municipalities have that can account for biodiversity issues. And I think that in doing that, in making it a priority that appears in different forums or different venues, I think that we can move towards the best possible response for a local approach to biodiversity conservation. So without further ado, I will pass the floor over to our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Cam. Aaron, were you going to say something?
No, go ahead. I just want to remind everyone that they can type their questions into the Q&A panel accessible at the bottom of the screen, and that we will take the questions after all the presentations.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to share with you the evolution of biodiversity conservation in Edmonton, my hometown. I'm proud of it. Cam has done an awesome job talking about where we are right now. The big city charters are really important. I want to take a little different approach, and I want to give you kind of a rapid fire review of how the city of Edmonton got to where we are and our history of conservation, because I think it helps articulate how we decided on what tools we were going to create in order to help us conserve urban biodiversity. So our story starts in 1904. And so why 1904 is a really important date is that's when we officially became a city. Obviously, Edmonton was around before that time. But the reason why the date's significant for me is because only 9 years later, Council approved the purchase and dedication of the first River Valley Park. This is an image of Victoria Park, Victoria Day celebrations of Victoria Park. The council had purchased it for $130,000 in 1912. And you can see central Edmonton, Victoria Park is in central Edmonton, was actually pretty much cleared of all of its woods. And if you know Victoria Park now, it's a cherished, well-vegetated area of the central core of our city. And back then, the equivalent of $130,000 in today's time is close to $3 million. And so back then, both citizens and council were keen and understood the value of protecting our river valley. Scooching up to 1967, where Cam had indicated that the Municipal Government Act was established, which provides the framework for which all municipalities have the provinces given them power to do some land use planning. There are some key tools that Cam had also mentioned around environmental reserve, municipal reserve, and conservation easements. So I want to highlight environmental reserve because this was really important in our evolution as a city that was trying to conserve our biodiversity and natural areas. This is just an excerpt from the Municipal Government Act of 1994. And the areas highlighted in blue, so the municipalities are allowed to dedicate areas of ravines, natural drainage courses, land that is subject to flooding or is considered unstable, or the requirement for providing a buffer for pollution or public access around water bodies. These are the 4 things that the city of Edmonton has consistently used since the MGA to try to protect our river valley. And also the definition, this came in 1967. So ravine conservation went full bore in the 1960s at a time when transportation corridors were also pushing through a lot of our ravines. And the citizenry actually spoke up and stopped a number of those transportation corridors from moving forward. Mill Creek is saved because of the actions of citizens who said, no, 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 we want to use the tools of the MGA and protect our ravine system. And now we have the beautiful Mill Creek ravine protected for everybody to enjoy. But what the MGA didn't provide municipalities with was a clear definition of natural areas elsewhere, or areas that should be protected outside of these unstable and flood-prone areas. And so in the 1980s and 90s, as the city was developing and into our neighborhoods, and people were realizing that we were starting to lose what we call our tableland natural areas. So that's all those natural areas that are outside of our river valley system. And so the city in the 90s, or we did our first mapping of natural history sites in 1986. And council in 1993 actually approved the definitions of what the city of Edmonton considers as environmentally sensitive areas and significant natural areas. And the first policy for actual conservation of natural areas for their biodiversity and habitat outside of areas that are unstable or prone to flooding occurred in 1995, and it was a policy that the city of Edmonton, it was a homegrown policy. We had a little bit of a wake-up call, though, in 1999. Citizens had pushed council and administration to develop some of these policies. But overnight, one of a favorite natural area in Northeast Edmonton called Little Mountain was pretty much cleared overnight. And it really led people to do some navel gazing and going, what? Like, these were in plans, we've got the policy to protect these things. But as was their right, the landowner decided they wanted to do something else with that piece of property. At the same time, the research community was looking into habitat loss and fragmentation and the understanding that this is the single largest threat to biodiversity conservation in an urban area. And what you see here is in the green boundary is the boundary of Edmonton in 1924. And what you see in the red are the estimated 90% loss of wetlands and drainage courses. So clearly something had to happen. So what was going on that the city wasn't able to protect some of these important natural areas? The best way to outline kind of how the MGA and how municipalities can use the Municipal Government Act and the tools it enables is through an example. And so this is Poplar Lake. It's an area up in Northeast Edmonton. It was deemed an environmentally sensitive area. This was a first hand-drawn map of it in 1986. The city has known about it for a long time. By the time development started occurring in this area, this is the area structure plan for Edmonton North. You can see that within the red box there is Poplar Lake, and next to it is a little star. And so if you look at the original Poplar Lake diagram in the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see what that is actually a woodlot. And so by the time we got to the area structure planning stage, could only be represented as a star because we actually didn't have very many tools to protect something that wasn't prone to flooding, which is what Poplar Lake was. It's a wetland, that's the nature of it. So this is where we have to look at municipal reserve as a tool for natural area retention. The key component of this is that red text that's going to come up a little later in the presentation, which is, this is at subdivision. A municipality may ensure that a part of a parcel of land is dedicated as municipal reserve, not to exceed 10% of that parcel. And also it could be used for public park, which natural areas are considered public parks, public recreation areas, and school board purposes. So at the time when the area structure plan was being completed, we didn't have enough MR to meet the needs of the school division and other recreational needs. And so the natural area, the woodlot part, which the MGA doesn't provide any tools for retention, was a star to say, well, we know we want to protect this. We're not quite sure how we're going to do it yet. And so the other thing you'll notice about this, up on the right-hand side of your screen now, is the neighborhood structure plan of Clair. You can see that the wetland is only part of the natural area is protected. And so this is another issue related to urban biodiversity conservation, is not all the time do you get to protect a whole natural area within one plan area. So a number of years later, the Crystallina Near neighborhood was produced, and you can see that the woodlot here, if you can see my arrow, is actually, the park was fully retained. It was a good moment. And why did this happen? We didn't suddenly get new MR. We didn't have a reduction in needs of school sites. But what we did have is a very progressive council and an active public who were saying, you need to find some tools to protect some of these natural areas that we don't have any tools to protect right now. So in 1999, council had actually approved a natural area reserve fund set for $250,000 a year. That was found in an urban area like Edmonton to not actually be enough to protect much. So we actually received an increase to that funding in 2008, specifically for the purchase of tableland natural areas. And so what we get is at subdivision, we now were able to protect the vast majority of, well, the woodlot through mostly purchase, and there was a little bit of MR left over, so we allocated that there. The other key thing about these tools that I mentioned earlier is the component of at subdivision. So remember the original natural areas mapped out in 1986, the whole planning process, including up to purchase, lasted until 2017. So that was 31 years to tool implementation and protection of this natural area. So during this time, council also understood we were, and also because of the public saying, you guys, what are you guys doing? You need to start looking at the river valley and connecting it into the tablelands. We need a whole system, a system that's greater than the sum of its parts. And so after a lot of public consultation and an identification that 90% of Edmontonians do care about biodiversity conservation, we had a major paradigm shift in our conservation way of how we're doing land use planning for conservation. And so we moved from a system of isolated protected areas to one that focused on ecological connections. So this is a Natural Connections Strategic Plan approved in 2007. That was linked to a council approved policy called the Natural Systems Policy. Now there are two key things about this policy. It's a one-pager. I recommend everybody read it. It's very relevant, it's a one-pager, nicely written, and it says we have to conserve, protect, and restore biodiversity throughout Edmonton, recognizing the urban context within which we work. Also, we need to use some science to do the work that we do. So this is the urban planning context that I just walked you through. We have our strategies. We start with our strategies. You can see the Natural Connection Strategic Plan. The way we grow is our current municipal development plan. So how are we going to move this ecological network approach through our land use framework, land use planning context? This one-pager document also directs administration to do 3 specific things. So it says, okay, administration, this is how you're going to do it. So one, we need to plan our city so that the ecological systems function at multiple scales. This is the neighborhood that, if you see at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the little wetland and natural area tree stand that we were talking about. It actually, in this area, we ended up connecting it to a retained natural hedge tree stand, very thin, but we connected it through our semi-natural areas such as school sites and other wetlands, retained wetlands, and stormwater management facilities. Now, presumably, when you're able to maintain an ecological network with the neighborhood, that can connect into your ecological network of the city, of which everybody knows the North Saskatchewan River Valley as being the main corridor of our system. And then presumably, if you retain your connectivity in your city, you can support regional connectivity. And the list goes on, where the ecological network model works on any scale, from continental to site scale. And it promotes systems thinking and intergovernmental collaboration, which you'll see in a second with some of the tools we've created. So implementation of this policy direction, we got to apply the ecological network approach. Now, we also, the second policy direction is that we require ecological information to support planning and development applications. So that means to us, we need to standardize it in a scientific way that is well described to all of our stakeholders. So this was our data before that I had shown you. Basically, the areas in green are natural areas. The areas in yellow are not natural areas. And so we realized very quickly that the simple presence absence mapping wasn't really facilitating the needs of biodiversity planning. We needed to know where the wetlands are, what type of tree stands there were. And we also had very little information on the intermunicipal buffer, which is really important if you're trying to maintain regional connectivity as well. So over a number of years, we developed a detailed ecological inventory that has ecological attributes within each polygon. And we wrote out these standards in manuals that anybody can pick up and duplicate. Also, taking us back to the land use planning process, you know, at our strategy level, we have these just very simple polygons. But as you move through the land use planning process, you can get more and more detailed information at the appropriate planning level. We've also created terms of reference for how we expect people to plan out the ecological network of a neighborhood. And those technical reports come to us ecological planners, and we get to review them to say, yes, this is great. This is how we can augment in a post-development world and how we can support biodiversity flow through that neighborhood. On the city level, this type of information and tool is really important for helping us understanding where our remaining natural wetlands were. planning epiphany. Once we had all this data, 25% of Edmonton's remaining wetlands exist in this tiny area. This is a Dakota ASP. Historically, we've had 90% loss. Here, council approved a very complex ASP that speaks to protection of about 50% of those wetlands. It's not 100%, but it's definitely not 10%. Similar to tree stands, we now have information on our forest types, and we can see very quickly where our endangered forest types are, which is our white birch, larch, and black spruce. Those 3 endangered forest communities make up less than 0.001% of our city. So we can now know where to focus limited conservation dollars in order to support some of that biodiversity protection. On the regional scale, we've got the Edmonton Metropolitan Regional Growth Plan. We were really excited in 2017 and 18 when we worked with our joint communities and obtained objective 2.1, which is to conserve and restore natural living systems through an ecological network approach. That was a good, we were really excited about that it was taken on as a regional approach. And then provincially, we can't take credit for all of the mapping and the great things that were happening because we actually copied the provinces, but we increased the resolution for the urban environment. But now that has enabled the province to help support regional mapping for the land use framework, where Edmonton, the stuff in red is what Edmonton has mapped out with our very detailed ecological inventory. And the government of Alberta has now tied into that and mapped all around it for 904,000 hectares around the city of Edmonton to promote that regional mapping. So the third policy direction, conserve Edmonton's natural systems and discharging their duties. Oh God, that's a big one, we thought. So that's where manage and monitor our natural system to maintain habitat connectivity and protect biodiversity. Cam is so right when he talks about resources. We do not have the resources to create a huge scientific program to monitor our biodiversity. But what we can do is try to look at connectivity analysis based on the great research that is occurring at the University of Alberta, such as through Colleen St. Clair's lab, and she's going to be presenting next. Using all of our new mapping information and new theories about using electrical theory and Ohm's law and resistance mapping to estimate wildlife connectivity across the city. This is our map that was generated using electric theory. And basically the idea is that those areas that are really hot on that map, the reds and the oranges and the yellows, are likely very important corridors that we should be looking at to protect for biodiversity movement. It doesn't mean that the black areas, there's no wildlife, but it means where are the main movement corridors and potentially pinch points. And it's with that where we've worked with the University of Alberta to develop a wildlife monitoring program where we set a number of cameras at some of those pinch points and areas where there seems to be a lot of habitat, and come up with an idea of kind of rough species richness. Of course, wildlife cameras really focus on the large mammals, but the idea is if you can move moose through your city, you're probably still maintaining enough habitat for the birds and the bees as well. So other municipal tools I haven't really touched upon. In 2007, the Ametenary Land Trust was formed. Edmonton was one of 6 partners. It really deals with conservation easements that I haven't touched upon and land donations. And then Cam also spoke quickly to the new MGA amendments. I'm not going to touch on that. Conservation reserve, because we have the Natural Area Reserve Fund, the cost of land is really, the earlier you buy it in the land use planning process, the cheaper it is for more land. And so conservation reserve occurs at the end of the process, which means that you've got really expensive land. So we're still evaluating how we as a city can utilize that. The city charter regulations require a climate change adaptation plan. And for those who are interested, Goal 10 actually speaks to ensuring clean air, clean water, and biodiversity is conserved in the city. So also in 2020, we've got the municipal development plan that's being updated. The Way We Grow did focus on maintaining a functioning ecological network. And we're pleased to see that in the draft of the city plan, which is actually at council this week, also maintains that history. And so we're really excited that hopefully this will continue on through time. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone. I hope I just got under time. And if people are interested in the actual legislative structure of how the city runs and does our biodiversity conservation, it's on the right-hand side of the screen here. And but if you want to know when policies were developed, I'll just put that up on the slide too. So thank you. I put my email up there just in case anybody has questions that I might not be around to answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. And next we have Colleen.
All right, I'll just take a moment to get my screen going here. And maybe I could just get a sense. Can you see that all right? Does anyone want to wave at me like?
Looks great.
Yeah, you can see it. Great. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today, everybody on the webinar. And second, thank you, other presenters, for lots of interesting information. I learned things from that too. And third, thank you to the Land Institute for hosting this event. What I'd like to do today is try to add to the perspectives that others have provided about protecting and managing urban biodiversity, and to offer you a little bit of a nuanced perspective, I guess, that stems from my position as a biologist. So, reiterating some of what Cam said, biodiversity is a lot of complexity. It's all these different levels of biological organization, but it is also all the interactions among and within those levels. So urban planners and legislators necessarily tend to focus on protection of commodities, the quality of air, water, and land, preserving habitat patches, for example. And conservation biologists tend to have an overwhelming focus on preserving vulnerable species and populations. So when you put these two things together, something a little bit accidental, I think, emerges, which is to have a kind of a blanket assumption that all species, all populations are in need of protection to promote biodiversity. And an overarching goal might be something like this: to preserve biodiversity in urban areas by maintaining a network of natural areas that support ecological processes, something Catherine really emphasized. And I absolutely ascribe to that view. Here's another depiction of it, where there's patches of habitat that are ideally connected by intervening stepping stones or corridors that support the movement of individuals and the persistence of these ecological processes. So that's all well and good, except that there's very little attention to the variation among species and among individuals within species, which have very different relationships with the process of urbanization. Actually, when we look at those species, we can see that there is relationships that vary from avoidance of urban infrastructure to attraction to it. And working with birds, McKinney has classified these usefully as being urban avoiders, like western tanagers here in Edmonton, that need our help to persist in urban areas, and adapters, like chickadees, that do pretty well without any intervention. And then exploiters, like house finches, which are actually increasing in urban areas with implications for other species. So in my work, focused on habitat fragmentation and ways of preserving biodiversity over the years, I've worked a fair bit on the avoiders and adapters. I'll give you some examples of those. So for example, with avoiding type species, we've studied questions like, how do they manage to navigate human infrastructure like roads? How do wolves do that? Forest birds, small rodents. And then in terms of the things people do in their urban environments, we've asked, how do practices like off-leash laws, bylaws, and mowing practices affect the diversity of rodents and birds? And then looking specifically at the movement of individuals, we've asked, especially for birds in temperate and tropical areas and agricultural and urban landscapes, how do they actually navigate these ecological corridors that we can see on maps? We've also worked quite a bit with adapters, and these questions tend to be a little bit more subtle. So in the cities of Edmonton and Calgary, we've worked on forest birds, asking what are the landscape features that support their persistence in urban areas? And then even more subtly, what kind of song characteristics vary and correlate with the persistence of birds in urban landscapes? Could it be not habitat that they lack, but actually enough quietness to hear each other? And then for my favorite adapter, we've asked, can some species adapt because they can do really subtle behavioral things like shift the frequency of their songs to be heard over traffic noise? And the answer, incidentally, is yes, chickadees can do that. But the group that really intrigues me are the exploiters. And the reason for that interest is because urban exploiters, which includes some of the adapters, are very prone to conflict with people. And if those species are large or carnivorous, or especially if they're both, conflict with people in urbanized areas is almost guaranteed. So over the years, I've become increasingly interested in those more nuanced aspects of retaining biodiversity in urban areas that focus on solving that kind of conflict that would otherwise prevent people from embracing biodiversity. And the species I've worked on most in that context is urban coyotes. So for the rest of my time today, I'm going to tell you about our studies on this species and try to paint a picture of why the task of protecting biodiversity for the benefit of ecological functions and people in urban areas is actually quite a nuanced and challenging one. So first, a little bit of context. Urban coyotes are kind of a new thing. In fact, the range of coyotes has expanded tremendously over the last couple of 100 years, now stretching throughout the North American continent and even recently into South America. And urban coyotes occupy now almost every city in North America. And in many of these cities, conflict with coyotes is rising. This is the context with which I began the Edmonton Urban Coyote Project about 10 years ago. I was interested in knowing if we understood better how coyotes manage to exploit cities, how specifically they do that. Could we reduce that conflict to promote coexistence with coyotes? And might we also learn something about the species that don't thrive in cities? What is it that they need help with? In the outset of this study, I was tremendously assisted with two really important people. Bill Abercrombie, who volunteered his time and resources to trap our coyotes so that we could study them with GPS collars, and Maureen Murray, a PhD student. Maureen's task and goal was to try to identify components of habitat selection and movement by coyotes, diet, and body condition that potentially contribute to conflict, reasoning that if she knew which of these things and how they contribute to conflict, they might be mitigated. So she did that in a conventional way, fitting these animals with GPS collars. We captured them in a variety of places, one of them being kind of industrial-sized compost sites. And something we noticed right away is that coyotes captured at compost sites tended to have mange. That's a skin parasite that causes itchiness and causes animals to sort of scratch out their own skin, and had a bunch of implications. The first one was that coyotes with mange occupied habitat very differently. So on the left, you see some healthy coyotes. They had typical looking home ranges, mostly in the river valley and ravine system that Catherine spoke of. But these mangy coyotes had ranges that were 10 times larger, largely overlapping, and with extensive use of residential areas. Not only that, but these mangy coyotes that lived more in residential areas were also much more likely to be active during the day. And these two things both increased their likelihood of encountering people and the perceptions people might have of those animals being in conflict. We were interested in what they were eating in those urban areas beyond the compost I mentioned already. We found that coyotes that were reported as being in conflict had different assimilated diets, which we measured with stable isotopes, than coyotes that were not reported as being in conflict. In particular, those conflict animals were eating less protein, which would support lower body condition, and they were eating more processed food, which we measured with the occurrence of corn in their diets. And so these animals had more conflict, and they also had crappier diets. And we were interested in what it was about these crappy diets, compost in particular, that might cause or contribute to poor health. And we also were interested in how that might affect their reliance on human use areas, particularly backyards. So here's another look at health divided into healthy and diseased coyotes, and in their likelihood of using backyards that offered some form of anthropogenic food. You can see diseased animals are much more likely to do that. And they were also much more likely to shelter under or near houses. And one reason for that might be this crappy food that they're eating, again, picking on compost. So we studied that with a couple of undergraduate students, Jesse Hill and Peter White. What Jesse did was sample compost looking for mycotoxins. These are metabolites of fungus that are known to suppress immune systems. And Peter looked for eggs of parasites, tapeworms in particular, in scats collected at compost and natural sites. And what we found was that compost samples did contain mycotoxins. In fact, they contained them at levels higher than what's permitted in animal feed because of this suppressing effect on immune systems. And we found that tapeworm eggs were 10 times more prevalent in scats collected at compost sites. So putting all of these parts of Maureen's work together, we drew a picture that looks like this. We proposed that as coyotes move from a natural habitat in river valley and ravine type places, and a natural diet eating prey in those kinds of habitats, to dependence on anthropogenic sources of food and habitat, they crossed into a different kind of state. They were different animals, even though they're of the same species. And we think this state was mediated largely by parasites. And once in this state of dependence on poor health, they were stuck there, creating ever higher rates, potentially, of conflict with people. So we think it's imperative to prevent access to human-sourced food and discourage access or use of residential areas. We're continuing to study this partly because the conflict with coyotes is ever increasing. This is a story from the news from a couple of years ago where a toddler was attacked on his own driveway in Burnaby. And interestingly, that attacking coyote showed evidence of having been food conditioned, relying on human food, and also disease. So with increasing reports of this sort, tolerance for coyotes, and with them other forms of biodiversity in cities, might decline. How could that change? Well, we wanted to know what we could contribute to this puzzle by looking a little more carefully at parasites, and in particular at one that's emerged recently. Maybe you've heard of this in the news. There is something worse than mange from coyotes. They carry a tapeworm called Ecological multilocularis. And although it has been in North America for decades, centuries, maybe millennia, there's a very new strain of it that's arrived from Europe quite recently. And within the last decade, quite a few people have been infected. 17 now is the count in Alberta. This parasite doesn't seem to do much to coyotes, but it's very harmful to the health of people. And Alberta seems to be the epicenter of these human infections, and Edmonton seems to have a particularly high rate of this parasite. So something I would really like to know is whether there are aspects of our urban practices that are contributing to the spread of this parasite or its prevalence in urban coyotes. The parasite is transmitted trophically between rodent prey and coyotes, but humans can get this as what parasitologists call accidental hosts of the parasite by accidentally ingesting eggs that are shed with feces and might contaminate soil. So the people that might be exposed accidentally could be gardeners, or trappers, or dog owners. And there's another way that this parasite might contribute to conflict, and that would be if it contributes to a change in the behavior of coyotes, for example, by making them more carnivorous. And incidentally, anecdotally, a very unusual attack by a coyote that killed a 110-pound dog a couple of winters ago was by a coyote that was infected with this parasite. So something that we're doing now, this work is led by Deanna Steckler, is trying to figure out if there's a link between the diets of coyotes and the occurrence of this parasite. And she's doing that by looking at the contents of stomachs that have been donated as carcasses to us. And it's early days. You'll be able to learn more about Deanna's work in a few months' time, but there is some suggestion that those coyotes that are eating indigestible anthropogenic food have much higher rates of this parasite than animals that aren't eating that kind of food. And by indigestible, I mean things like food wrappers, and in this picture, that part of a leather glove. All of the things in that picture came from the stomach of a single coyote. Another thing we're doing is trying to monitor wildlife more generally. Catherine mentioned this briefly, and then most recently trying to integrate coyote management and policy with some engagement by citizens. So I'll say just a few words about those two topics. For monitoring, we've put out this grid of cameras that Catherine mentioned, and our work on this is being led by master's student Cassie Stevenson. She has a really unenviable task of going through these some couple million photos and coding all of the detections of wildlife of all the various types that we're finding on them. So it's a big job, and she'll have more to report in about a year's time. But what we're seeing already is a surprising diversity of animals in Edmonton. Not surprisingly, mostly in these river valley and ravine areas, but also in these urban parks where we are assuming that higher rates of connectivity is supporting greater movement of animals and greater prevalence of them. One of the things we hope to measure is which species correlate with the presence of coyotes, which are so far our most abundantly detected mammal species. Another thing that we're doing that will start soon, and this will be led by a new MSc student, Gabrielle Lajeunesse, is to engage upon some citizen-based hazing or aversive conditioning of coyotes. And our goal here is to seek out coyotes that are hanging out in residential areas, especially those that are doing that during the day, and then chase them and throw things at them, like this frightening tennis ball covered in flagging tape. This is an approach to coyote management that is being initiated all over North America in a variety of ways. And what we hope to do with it is stop this trajectory of habituation where animals are comfortable being around people that makes it much more likely that they will then move on to food conditioning, where these problems of food subsidies might also invoke these relationships with parasites and ultimately contribute to conflict. If we can nip that in the bud, we think we have a better opportunity to keep coyotes in the range of interactions that McKinney would have called adapters or even avoiders, where coyotes might share space with people in urban areas, but they don't share that space at the same time because they avoid people. The goal would be to teach them more awareness around people. And if we can achieve that with coyotes, there might be some scope to try similar things with other species that are exploiters of urban areas to achieve this goal that I identified at the outset of trying to preserve biodiversity in urban areas by maintaining a network of natural areas that support ecological processes, including the movement of individuals. But to do that in a more nuanced way that keeps species abundance and types of behavior within natural ranges of variation. And if we can achieve that, then I think we could look towards having biodiversity in cities that is more diverse and includes species that we aren't necessarily used to seeing in cities, making that more tangible. And what I'm saying is that if we are going to have species like horned grebes persist in cities, and I've seen them here in Edmonton's Horlock Park Duck Pond, only once, mind you, if we're going to do that, we're going to have to manage species that would otherwise just continue to increase in their abundance, like Canada geese, and drive out these other species, as well as create conflict with people. So I'll leave you with those thoughts by thanking the people that supported our studies on coyotes, and I want to thank you once more for listening.
Thank you, Colleen. It's time to open up the virtual floor, to borrow Cam's expression, to your questions. We do have some questions already in the Q&A chat window, and then questions for Catherine could be emailed to her at the email address that is on your screen in your chat window. So, Kim, should I just go ahead and read the first question?
Yeah, and just an invitation to pop more questions into the Q&A box, and any questions, as you said, we'll forward to Catherine and get her to reply.
So why don't I take the first one? I see a question from Hugh. How different are the municipal legal mandates between our provinces? And I'll just say that traditionally, the focus of municipal power and municipal purpose is defined by reference to the welfare of the residents. And in most provinces, the municipal legislation still speaks about municipal purposes in terms of good government, services, safe and viable communities. And you can look up legislation in places like Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But we do have sort of two pioneers here. So our very own MGA, fostering the well-being of the environment, is an explicit municipal purpose. And then also, if you look up the City of Toronto Act, it authorizes the city to regulate for the environmental well-being of the city. So this is independent of human welfare, and there's explicit reference there to climate change as well. Cam, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I answered that one in a chat function while the other conversations were ongoing. We looked at BC and Ontario a little bit as analogs, and we found that they were trending in the same direction. So as kind of the different provinces have seen subsequent amendments, often we get more movement towards some of these approaches. And the other wrinkle that I'd say for the Alberta experience is the land use, or the Stewardship Act, right? The Provincial Land Use Stewardship Act, which has had some interesting obligations in regional planning overlays for municipal actions. So that's kind of been a unique, or at least interesting experience here. But yeah, I'd say that as Canadian provinces look to renovate or change their MGAs or equivalents, we see more movement towards an environmental focus for sure.
Great. Our next question in my window is from Dave, and it's to all of the panelists. What role is there for municipalities to encourage individual landowners to take steps to support biodiversity at the yard and neighborhood level?
I'm happy to jump in, unless, Colleen, do you have something you want to say first?
I have something to say, but I'll say it after you, Cam. Go ahead.
Sure. So I'll just share my screen again really quickly, just because I anticipated something a little bit like this. And here's a graphic that we had from the end of our report. And it shows some of the different aspects for municipal participation with someone's backyard, because if we're going to think local, why not think as local as possible? And so individuals' own experiences. And this was a sort of a draft brochure or pamphlet that we thought about as an educational tool for different rollouts. One would be through new home purchases, through real estate agents and those sorts of things. But another is obviously linking it to your municipality. And one of the programs that we were really interested in was Edmonton's Master Naturalist program, which was oversubscribed and utilized as a citizen education experience, where you could kind of become a steward for the environment in your community and get involved with different things that were being rolled out with some training and some experience. And that program, unfortunately, was concluded. It ended because of uncertain funding. But we definitely thought that one of the roles of a municipality could be education and outreach. And there's a variety of forms that could take, but there's a lot of cool stuff I think individuals can do in their own backyard that can really, be inspired by some of that municipal encouragement, including naturescaping, getting involved in some of the local online tools and portals that are available for monitoring biodiversity that's coming through your area, and adopting some of these tools voluntarily that help connect your parcel of land, right, to maybe green spaces or communities that are around you, and then becoming part of the larger landscape again. And so I definitely would focus on the education and outreach perspective that municipalities can offer. And there's some different examples of that in the Alberta experience, and something like the Master Naturalist program in Edmonton, I think will be much missed and could definitely play a role like this in the future.
I'll also try to quickly share my screen and offer a few thoughts. As I guess you would guess from my presentation, I think it's critically important to do the things Cam just encouraged on that slide, which were to create native habitat and eliminate or reduce use of pesticides. Canopy trees are tremendously important, understory is tremendously important, but to do that without feeding wildlife. And I think one of the things that is really a little bit confusing at first to people is that providing food subsidies to wildlife doesn't actually help them very much, especially if they're on natural food subsidies. So feeding bread to birds, probably everybody on this call knows, is a really bad idea. But people might underestimate how much feeding birds even healthy foods tends to increase house sparrows, which tend to decrease other forest bird species or songbird species. So I suppose my main message about this nuance would be that retaining a healthy kind of biodiversity in urban areas requires this sort of next step of sophistication in promoting native biodiversity and having an awareness of the problems caused by hyperabundance of species. And for specific species like coyotes, where conflict results from all kinds of other reasons, there's some additional things that I think could be done.
Another question from John. Where do the monies in the Natural Area Reserve Fund come from? Is there an incentive provided to those who donate the funds? I don't know if Cam or Colleen, you know a little bit about this one. If not, I'm just going to refer this question to Catherine.
Yeah, I bet she'll know. I think some of the reserve fund, Cam, correct me if I'm wrong, comes from developers. They're required to contribute to the reserve fund. I don't actually know anything about a donation source in the reserve fund.
Yeah, and I don't have the answer to this one off the top of my head either. Definitely, I think Catherine is the best situated to address it.
Our next question is from Cara. What is being done to address urban sprawl which affects biodiversity? For example, the city of Edmonton recently annexed hundreds of acreages of farmland and natural areas for development from Leduc County.
Yeah.
I mean, this is clearly a policy question. I think our panelists can address the question from their perspective.
Colleen, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. And I'll just say that sprawl is really challenging for conservation in urban areas for all kinds of reasons that people probably appreciate. One explanation I heard for the annexation of those surrounding areas was to reduce the incentive for sprawl by making an externality out of the the costs, the tax base, basically, for subdivisions in those far-flung areas and increasing the capacity of cities to control how development proceeded and where it proceeded. So that might be a naive view. I'm no kind of expert on this issue, but I have been pleased to see Calgary and Edmonton both trying to address the issue of sprawl, not only from an economic and cultural standpoint, but also from a biodiversity one.
Yeah, and from a policy perspective, also, I think that sprawl is something that is one of those meta level problems, right? For addressing these issues, and it comes at a time where we also see a great push, especially in Edmonton right now, towards new infill development and the revitalization of older neighborhoods. And I think that both of them kind of can be addressed hand in hand with the biodiversity concern. I mean, a lot of the tools that I was talking about were, especially something like a conservation reserve. Those are definitely more relevant to new subdivision processes and where land is being converted. And I think we also need to pivot a little bit and think about the way that our green spaces, even in the mature neighborhoods, are being managed or manicured and affecting biodiversity. So I would say that we need to both look outward and inward for these sorts of issues. And part of it goes with the general education push and experiential push for people who, a lot of folks, my friends, are now looking to move back in to a core area where they can commute in a different way and they can live in a city a different way, versus kind of the push 10 years ago, which was to live in a more suburban kind of experience. And so I think there's part of a reactionary response that's happening there as well. But it's definitely one of the meta level issues, and you can think of some of the biodiversity concerns that are happening there: transformation of farmland into developed area, the stripping of the topsoil. There's lots of different issues that are going to be at play when you're looking at that. So definitely it's one of those higher level issues when we're thinking about managing our overall impact and footprint on the landscape. And I think we need to think of it both as how far are we going, and then what are we doing internally where we already have development to maintain those corridors and connections that Colleen was talking about in green spaces and stepping stones.
Yeah, I echo these sentiments, and our policymakers, our municipal policymakers, have a mandate to accommodate new growth, and not just our existing residents, but future residents. And they've taken admirable steps to encourage development within our existing envelope, but it is not going to be possible to accommodate all of the growth without gobbling up more open areas. And so the focus might become how do we treat those areas better than we've treated them before in terms of biodiversity, etc. Okay, we have time maybe for two more questions. Susanna, it would be great to see the ideas presented by Cam and Catherine applied in rural municipalities, towns and counties. If anyone is working on that, I would be interested. Bigger level connectivity, ecological networks, etc. Obviously, we have a very strong rural base in the province, including very active rural municipalities who maybe do not have the same resources as some of their as the larger cities. So Cam and Colleen, what do you say to this?
Go ahead, Cam. I don't know that I have a lot of expertise for this one.
Sure. I mean, it's something that I've thought quite a bit about, because when I was speaking about biocultural diversity and those sorts of experiences, we have to think about the biodiversity across the larger landscape, right? And we did in the report, we kind of started urban and then thought urban, peri-urban, rural. And a lot of what we ended up thinking about involved, some of the intermunicipal collaborations and regional experiences that different municipalities of different sizes might be thinking about. Because when you can think about Edmonton's River Valley, you can think about all of the smaller municipalities and areas of human habitation that river and a lot of the species that use that river valley will be moving through as you are entering and then leaving Edmonton. And so yeah, I completely agree that it's a matter of scale, and it's a matter of resourcing, and it's a matter of experience. But I do think that as a rural municipality with different sorts of land impacts and land uses, I think that you can take some of the ideas that are being proposed for the larger municipal cities and think about how those innovations or changes can be applied in a bit of a different but experience with the same sort of concerns. So I agree, we thought about it a little bit. It becomes a more difficult experience sometimes when you're putting yourself in that different environment, but I do think it's an area where there could be room for collaboration and idea sharing about what has worked in a more urbanized experience, and then how that can be applied, scaled and resourced appropriately for a rural experience.
Thanks, Cam. I have a comment from Linda, who shares some insights and invites you to get in touch with her about some education efforts. So I'm gonna save that text and let you read it. And then I think we have time for a final question. This one is from Chris, both a question and an observation. One of the challenges municipalities have is that we have limited authority to manage wildlife unless they are a pest species. So we can control coyotes, but not say deer, which can be problematic in urban centers. This would mean that issues around disease and wildlife health may really be dependent on provincial resources, and urban wildlife management is not always their priority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll tackle that one, and I'll try to tie it a little bit to the previous question. I think that is one of the big challenges for managing wildlife in urban contexts, is this kind of jurisdictional disconnect with provincial authorities. I know that that's being worked on, though, by folks in Edmonton, Calgary, probably other municipalities, and provincial employees in several ministries. Lots of people recognize the challenge that that poses. Deer is a great example of a species that we all think of as being kind of vulnerable and needing our protection in cities, and I suppose they do in a variety of ways, but they're another urban exploiter. Just ask anyone that lives in the municipalities of the Columbia River Valley in BC, and they're really good at exploiting people and avoiding predators in cities. So as the distribution of species changes, I think we'll need these tools to change with them, and I can imagine a day in the not distant future where municipalities have to have much more ability to manage and even control deer. So that's a great point. And I like to think people are working on it pretty actively.
Okay, I'm afraid that we've come to the end of the webinar. So please join me in thanking Colleen and Cam and Catherine for their engaging presentations, and I certainly have gained a new respect for the chickadee. And Kim, thank you so much for helping us host this webinar. If you have further questions, you can email them to the presenters directly, or you can email them to us at albertalandinstitute.ca, one word, albertalandinstitute.ca, and we'll forward them. So thanks again for joining us, and we do hope to see you in future ALI events. And I'm just going to turn it over to you, Kim, maybe for a quick wrap up. No?
Sure. Yeah. Just a thanks to everyone who joined us today and stayed on. We had over 60 participants throughout the whole of the webinar. Give me a few days or maybe about a week's grace to get the webinar processed and the replay page up, and then the email out to you that the replay is available. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye for now.